Hello, everyone. Chris Martinson here. This is an off-the-cuff podcast. It's September 16th, 2020, and kind of a historic day for the Fed coming out and speaking again. It's almost a historic day when the Fed speaks, and so we wanted to code a little bit of that in as well. Just talk about some of the challenges we're facing, and boy, we have somebody who can really hit both of those with feet running on the ground. Axel Merk today, coming back with us today. Axel, welcome to the program. Let's start with the fires. I understand you actually got directly singed this time.
Yeah, well, as the Carmel Valley fire is called, next to Monterey, and we have a place there. We've talked about it. We have a little vineyard there that we're developing, and just as the fire was approaching, I jumped into trucks to get there to kind of move the track to the middle of the field and so forth. Well, I couldn't make it anymore because it wasn't the next door fire that was moving in. Instead, it was a different fire. Either it had jumped, nobody knows the origin of it, and so we actually then got some feedback in the news because an Associated Press freelance photographer had taken pictures on our property. We didn't know about it. And so I said, hey, I recognize this place. And so we got some pictures before we were allowed to go back in. The short of it is we were extremely fortunate compared to many others that have lost pretty much everything. We do have damage, but over 90% of the vineyards were saved. And there are some, we call them structures, a barn and a house and the like. And the firefighters defended it amazingly. So I've gained huge admiration for them, and not just for the firefighters, but also for PG&E. Right? We love to kind of talk badly about PG&E. That's the utility company here, but the field workers are first class. We had in our property 30 of these workers to redo the power poles. The firefighters had sawed one off because it was a torch and they were worried about it being a threat and things like that. And so they had to redo the power for the entire valley. And they flew in things with helicopter. They were pulling new lines. Some people were cutting trees, some tightening the lines, all kinds of things. So obviously not everything goes well in a crisis, and there are plenty of places where people have plenty to complain about. But those folks on the ground, be that fire police or PG&E, they did an amazing job down there.
Yeah, well, that's really good to hear. And yeah, often the people who work for a company do great work. Company can make kind of funny management decisions. So that's a tough one for a utility like that, where you're trying to balance shareholder returns and doing things like maintenance and things like that. But as well, tough job because people are living further and further out into areas that I think by law they have to supply electricity to, and people are living in places where fires happen more in some instances. So that's a tough balancing act, I would think.
Of course, absolutely. And one of the biggest challenges we talked offline is we have a well there, and the well needs electricity to run. And so we brought in a big generator and whatnot, and I play around with solar installations and to get things running, not for the well pump itself, but for the irrigation part of it. So lots and lots of projects, learned a great deal, made the entire system more robust as part of the experience and whatnot, and consider to deploy solar even for the well pump. For those who know about numbers, it's a 15 horsepower pump. It draws typically about 10 kilowatt when running, and so that's quite a bit of power. And so we have lots of projects ahead to make things even more resilient, to use a peak prosperity word.
Yes, well, good. Where does that water come from?
From underneath, from about 400 feet below the ground. And so there are some hills around where it just comes from. One of the projects I've had, one of the reasons I installed these solar panels is because sometimes in August we don't have enough water. And so by automating some of these things, you can control the flow better of when you pull the water and balance the load. We use about 15% less water than a year ago. And so it's already paid off from that point of view. Now I've programmed it mostly by necessity to only pull power during the off hours. So there are all kinds of things you can do to improve things and to be more resilient. I programmed a failover system to switch between the grid and the solar. I don't even lose the power during the switching. And so that's all kinds of little gadgets. So when I don't live in the investment world, I'm a weekend farmer, and I love that stuff.
Yeah, well, I love it too. I'm not dealing with what you're dealing with. I do wonder about the 10% of the vines you think you lost. Obviously, I don't have near as much experience as you, but I've been growing grapes for a long time. And one year I accidentally backed my riding lawnmower over one of my better vines right to the ground. Wouldn't you know it, the next year I actually had the best harvest off of that vine. So grapes like a good amount of abuse, you know?
Yes, well, in this case, these when we bought this place 3.5 years ago, we had a very small vineyard. We planted quite a bit. Luckily, only half the expansion for other reasons, and so these are very young vines, and so they don't they are far more fragile, and they also need a lot of water in the young years, and so yeah, you see the heat damage very clearly. They have in other areas that weren't planted. The firefighters were had fire on both sides. We have a ravine in the forest, and so they just took some scissors or pliers and just cut across, right, so that they could move back and forth. And so, of course, there's a little bit of work and that we have to rebuild this. But the good news is that the property was defensible and the firefighters did it. It's the first time I felt that I really got my taxpayers' money worth because they did a terrific job on the property.
Well, I'm very thankful that didn't turn out worse for you, but it has turned out pretty bad for a lot of folks. It's been a very bad fire season, and little mystery about where all these fires are actually coming from and whether some are being intentionally set and all of that. And so that must just add a lot of psychological.
And so just kind of the local volunteer firefighting group, three of the firefighters lost their homes fighting the fire for other people, right? They were defending it. They lost their own. And so, I mean, what are you going to do? We donated to them, to their GoFundMe page and so forth, but that's not going to make up for the sort of losses they have, right? And also, we're in a lucky situation. Sure, we have damage. Sure, we have lots of work, but we can afford it, right? It's not our sole source of livelihood, and so we are extremely fortunate, despite all the challenges that have come with all of that.
Yeah. Well, this year is, I think, for a lot of people, pointing out that resilience is important, and that having multiple backup systems and different approaches and being flexible, all of that, because our plans are not really working out on my end. We're just dealing with the next 10 days has no rain on it, like the last 10 days, like the 10 days before that, and that's what we've been dealing with for a long time. I have a spring, which gives me about 10 gallons a minute right now. It's running a little light because of the lack of rainfall this year, but it's still flowing. So the worst of it is I have patches of field. My irrigation's a lot less technical than yours. Mine involves 2 lawn sprinklers that I move by hand all over.
Exactly. But to talk about the resilience topic here for a moment, right? Most of us, we can deal with a crisis. The challenge is what happens when you have a crisis on a crisis on a crisis. And so we run a small business, right? Manage some money. And so operationally, we were prepared in many ways. The challenge is really the mental health management, right? You're stuck at home, you have all these challenges and so forth. And then, of course, something goes wrong here, something goes wrong there, and at some point people have enough, right? And so you got to, you always have to worry about motivating your people, and I have a fantastic team. But it's become a full-time job just to make sure, because everybody's in a different life situation, have different concerns, and they're all real concerns, right? It's in the good old days, you show up for work and you kind of think, oh, whatever they do at home is their problem, right? But these are all your problems now as well when there's a crisis. On top of that, most of my folks have to deal with this horrible air quality we've had here for a while.
Yeah. And I've never been around it, that sort of horrible air quality. How bad is it?
Well, as you may know, I'm a private pilot, so I sniffed some oxygen. I have a supplemental oxygen bottle, and I said, well, maybe that helps, right? I don't know. I walked outside, I got a headache, and then I took on an N95 mask. My headache went away. So to me, that means it's bad enough. So my body tells, no, I don't like it. And you said, hey, the background looks good. Last time we spoke, I was in a different place that doesn't have air filtration, and so I moved here to an office I used to use at our home, where we have an air filtration system, and so it makes a huge difference. And so we don't know what we have until we don't, right? We should appreciate good air. It makes. I'm somebody who needs oxygen to live and breathe, and I love to go jogging outside, for example. This morning, I went jogging for the first time in weeks because the air quality was good.
Yeah. What a blessing you have some air filtration there. One of the more formative books of me was reading about the Dust Bowl and just the descriptions of what it was like to live in that time when you would have these howling, the blue northers would come and they would be black because they're just full of soil, but dust. And people would describe that the first few days of it was bad enough, 50, 60, 70 mile an hour screaming winds. They lived in houses that often had gaps around the windows. But it was about the first week after that where you're just coated in dust, and just that would start to wear on people's mental health, just the howling and the dust.
And it's not just the dust. One of the things I thought is that a fire is the best poison oak control ever, or poison ivy in your neighborhood, I suppose. And but
think about that.
But it's not, because it stays in the ash. And so I retrieved the fire hose that the firefighters left behind in the forest and brought it back to them. And it was, I wear long sleeve shirts because I don't want to take any risks. But that day I didn't take enough precautions, had a sweaty arm, and my entire arm was swollen at the end of the day. On top of that, a wasp decided to sting me just for the fun of it. And so there are all these things, how nature is showing that it's around and powerful, right? And we're learning, and we've become very humble about what we do on this planet here.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a good humility to develop, because
definitely,
absolutely. So let's switch gears now. It was a Fed day. I didn't get to see all of it, but from what I did see of Powell's testimony, I thought it was one of his worst press conferences so far. That was my assessment of it. He seemed unsure of himself. He was checking his notes. He was coughing. He wasn't looking his usual hale and hearty self, where he can blithely say the Fed didn't see it coming, but has all the tools necessary to manage whatever happens, or whatever the usual statement is, right? So I'm wondering what your take is on that. And as well, he said the Fed doesn't have any tools to address inequality,
Suddenly, whereas when it went good, it was all his job that he didn't. They have this new policy that was long in the making. We had two dissents today. One of them on the hawkish, one on the dovish side, and then Kaplan pretty much said, hey, I'd like to have a little bit more flexibility, which is a nice way of saying, hey, I don't like any of this crap. No, Powell in August, when he announced that they have this new grand average inflation target, said it was unanimous. And we chat a lot with folks at the Fed, former ones in particular. And the feedback I got is the reason why they had no dissents is not that everybody was on board with this new policy, but because they think that this new policy muddles things and makes things more confusing. And if they were to dissent on it, it would only add to that. And so instead, they express their things a little bit differently in speeches and whatnot, but they kind of sign on to it and let the chief do whatever he wants to do. The problem, of course, is that all this stuff hasn't been defined. Well, what does it mean to let inflation run over 2%? How much? How long? And so all these are very ambiguous topics, aside from the fact that the entire policy is, of course, bad at face value, right? You cannot make policy dependent on based on what happened in history. You have to have a forward-looking policy, and so this entire thing is somewhat mumble jumble. And so, but as far as the markets are concerned, hey, we know the Fed is going to have your back. We also know that real interest rates are low, and if it's up to him, they're going to go lower. And so since sometimes I've heard talk about gold, that thing is very sensitive to what real interest rates are, and so that of course is meat to the gold bugs, and not just to the gold bugs, to a broader investor base that says, hey, maybe gold isn't such a bad thing in this sort of environment, and we see certainly great interest in that. But yeah, ultimately, I mean, I'm more in the camp that if you have a central bank, they should tell you what they're going to do. And with that, I don't mean just, hey, we keep interest rates at zero, but based on what? Right? What's the reaction function? What's the sort of thing that gets them to do something? And all of that hasn't really been formulated. The only thing that's been clear is that we've come to the stage where we now are going to wait for inflation to be above 2%. The question really is, what sort of environment are we going to be in for inflation to be above 2%? And will it be appropriate at the time to do the sort of policy that we do now? My best guess is that the Fed doesn't really know what it got itself into here.
Well, I would agree with that. And I'm also wondering about this whole idea that you could even have a rate of inflation that's meaningful, given how it's measured, also given that it's trying to uniformly apply this to 330 million people, some rural, some urban, some old, some very young. So the question is 2% of inflation for who? You know?
Well, I mean, the Fed says they otherwise said core PCE. And so at least we know what they're targeting. We may disagree with that. Now, all that said, we know, and the Fed knows, all economists know that inflation currently is bullshit. And sorry, my very technical language here, but the average consumption basket is just not whatever they have put into inflation. That's what it's supposed to be, right? We can disagree how it's measured, but we know that whichever way it's measured, even economists agree that it currently is not measuring the right thing. Because in COVID, we're just consuming differently. And there's just no way for the methodology to catch up. Fear not, they'll probably do that at some point. So yeah, we have a moving target that is ill-defined and people disagree with. But the short of it is, yeah, they want high inflation. And of course, the reason they want high inflation is to pay for all this stuff, right? I mean, we're spending trillions, and importantly, we've given the government a taste of what it's like to spend trillions.
So for people who may not be familiar, because they always skip over this part, the Fed says we want 2% inflation. You get a lot of questions around that, but you don't get this one, which is why? What does inflation do for the system that's so beneficial as compared to deflation, which I like falling prices. I like cheaper things, but that's
me. Because you got money, right? If you have debt, you prefer inflation. And the government, and the government is in charge, they like to inflate the debt away. And so that's so the savers are not being asked. It's that we have a credit-driven system. In a credit-driven system, you need to have eternal growth, and you've written a lot about growth over the years, right? And how that you don't get the bang for the buck at some point. And so it's kind of it's like the mouse in the little wheel, running faster and faster and faster, right? And what can possibly go wrong in that? And so we are at a stage, and one of the dangers right now is that both Republicans and Democrats see that we can spend trillions and nothing bad happens. Hey, the stock market goes up, and so there's nothing bad about it. And so it's that I think that's really the worst about all of this. And so I don't think it doesn't really matter who gets elected. We'll be spending a boatload more money.
So are any of these Fed officials, former Fed officials that you're in contact with, are any of them planting gardens or putting extra food in the basement or anything like that? I mean, what I'm sort of asking.
They have a pension. They have a pension. They don't need to put the food in the garden.
How worried are they? Do any of them sort of have like a public sort of statement than a private, shopping list that's, I don't know.
The private statements are sometimes a little different from the public ones, but the essence is related.
Yeah.
But there's certain choice of words that are sometimes not exactly appropriate for the public consumption.
Well said. Very diplomatic. But I look at this and I see the Fed skating on thinner and thinner and thinner ice, and as far as I'm concerned, they're actually skating on water right now, because they've said, their whole strategy, as far as I can tell, is they're just going to keep applying monetary liquidity and pressure to the system until it fixes itself somehow. But they're not real clear what that's going to look like or how that might work or why it's not really quite working. But they must know somewhere in the bowels of the Fed research staff that that there is a limit to every credit expansion. Eventually, you just run out of credit-worthy things to put your credit against. Eventually, you're scraping the bottom of the barrel. That was subprime borrowers in 2000. It was pets.com in 2000, and subprime borrowers in 2007. But, this time, I see companies loading up on debt, and a lot of them are companies I would never lend to for any reason.
Yeah, I think that the one thing that the Fed has rarely ever been accused of is worrying about the problem of tomorrow. and so they'll address that when the time comes, I suppose, right? And the way they address it is by printing more money, I suppose, right? But the current concern is inflation. And the reason, of course, is the context for all of this is that they don't want, quote unquote, financial conditions to deteriorate. They want these junk bond yields to not have too high a spread over treasuries. That's what they want to contain. Now, if you're a restaurant owner, good luck asking for a loan. I mean, you might have access to PPP money or have had access to it, but access to credit for small business is tight. But if you have access to the public markets, that's what the Fed can control. And if you put in there, and in any of this that, hey, under these and these circumstances, we'll start tightening again. They are petrified that the market is going to kind of have a fit, a taper tantrum. And so that's why even they think of these ridiculous things of yield curve control. Because if you have yield curve control, you may need to buy less because you're just telling them you might do something. Now, obviously, you put in red lines, you have things that the market can suddenly burst through and violate. And instead of having yield curve control, instead of just saying, hey, we need to buy less, they could just buy fewer securities, right? So they're buying billions a month. If they needed to buy less, the obvious thing would be to buy less. But they're petrified about doing that because they're worried about a taper tantrum. So they're doubling down on what they do. And if they ever need to do something else, they'll worry about that tomorrow.
Well, why are they terrified of prices going downwards? Here's my simpleton interpretation, is because they're afraid once things start to correct towards reality, you'll get that overshoot and prices will really correct, and that'll have some damaging impacts. But otherwise, they seem terrified of the markets.
Well, because in a credit-driven society, you can't have credit market seize up. It's as simple as that, right? I mean, if credit is not available, the system collapses. And we had indications of that in March for a few hours overnight, that one evening, and where you saw currencies move 10% in a minute or so. Stuff that's just surreal. You don't want that to happen. It's as simple as that.
Okay. But they created the conditions where that could happen, and now they don't want it to happen. So I know you just said nobody accused him of thinking about tomorrow, but what's the plan here? What's the plan? What are they doing?
Would you like me to read the statement? They tell you what the plan is. That we will keep rates between 0.25% until we see a sustainable rate at 2% and then some. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here because I don't know what this is. That is the plan. So I'm answering your question. The next question.
So keeping rates low cures all. And the way the Fed keeps rates low is direct and indirect. The direct way is they throw money into the markets and they siphon assets, mostly debt instruments, back. That puts lots of liquidity out there. There's lots of liquidity sloshing around. It's all fighting for a place to go. Because it's fighting for a place to go, it's driving rates down. Directly, they're buying they're buying, instruments. Like nobody can argue that the actual low yields on mortgage-backed securities and junk debt is not due to the Fed buying those things directly. So,
I mean, in fairness to them, they don't have any tools, right? And so you could argue they shouldn't be doing any of this stuff. But it's Powell. I mean, you said, hey, you can't fix whatever, all the wealth problems in the world. But he's been saying that it's due to the Fed that minorities get jobs and whatnot. But those are not monetary issues. Those are fiscal issues, right? And so it would be, and that's part of the problem with all of this, is that the fiscal folks want to outsource everything to the Fed. Let's pile yet another responsibility on the Fed, rather than taking away responsibilities, because these are things the Fed simply cannot solve. Let Congress worry about this thing and get their job done, right? And there are difficult answers. And by the way, the squabble we have right now on the next stimulus is, if you take the politics out a little bit, it's classic what Democrats want and Republicans want, right? Where do you put the money? And those are questions that elected officials are supposed to resolve. And we may fall on one line or the other, but just printing trillions is not going to solve anything.
I think Democrats and Republicans would disagree with you on that one.
Oh, really? I mean, it's all, yeah. I mean, obviously you can always think that that there is a savior there, and it's also, of course, nice to blame somebody, right? Like Trump loves to blame other people, and so what? Powell's a perfect punching bag, right? It doesn't mean that he has the power to do certain things. And by the way, he's already kind of put Christmas and New Year's and everything on the plate and saying, hey, there's free money for all as far as the eye can see. Now it's your turn.
But it's inarguable, though, that even as the Fed does that, it's those actions have consequences, right? So when you buy financial assets, you drive up the prices of financial assets. The gains mainly accrue to the people who hold those financial assets, which is primarily certain households and certain entities and individuals, right? So the rich get richer. right? That has a consequence. It's a social consequence. It's a big one. It's pretty important. Same thing, they're buying bonds from Apple and Walmart and other big giant, liquefied companies. And as you mentioned, I talk with people who are in the small business lending side, and it's not just tight, it's impossible to get loans in certain sectors. So Main Street, mom and pop restaurants, small and medium-sized enterprises are getting crushed, and the big ones are winning. So I see the Fed as a redistributive organization. We're going to take from here and give to there, because in their estimation, they've determined that rich people having the funds.
They have opened themselves up to that accusation, rightfully so, because they're engaging there in micromanaging, allocating capital, which is fiscal policy. And they've dug themselves a hole, and that attracts a political influence, right? And that's only going to make things worse. And so, but yes, low interest rates help those who know how to deal with credit. Absolutely. But it's the tool that they got. And so now, of course, they say, hey, let's have MMT so to give money to the other folks as well.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be probably the logical next step.
Yeah, I mean, I wade around in the details, but my macro complaint is that what the Fed is really trying to do by just having credit grow, and I understand if it's a decision between grow and collapse, it's kind of hard to make the argument for collapse. But at the same time, this grow all the time path leads to a place where we run out of earth at some point. There's a macro policy. I don't, is that not the Fed's decision? But maybe culture needs to come up with an answer. But I see the Fed as working really hard to sustain a system that I think we have enough data now to say it's unsustainable.
Well, my view on that has been, since 2008, the best short-term policy is a good long-term policy. It's a very simple concept, but if you just think about a lot that's being done at the Fed or that has been done in Congress, is that stuff really good to put us long-term on a sustainable path? And instead, we have these ad hoc firefighting tools that we deploy everywhere. Guess what? That just leads us from one unintended consequence to the next one. And the worst is that, in capitalism, we should have an efficient capital allocation process. But the moment you have a crisis, the rules of the game get changed, right? You can't allocate capital based on how things should happen, because who knows what, right? The next guy is going to get bailed out. And so this time around, they try to be more tactful. They have a mainstream lending program, which of course is not for Main Street. And so they want to sound better. So, and this time around, the ire is directed at some other folks. So the banks, have you noticed, are not the bad guys right now. It's social media that's the bad guys. So, but it's the same stuff, of course. And of course, the one thing that suffers is a good long-term policy, be that on the monetary or on the fiscal side.
Yeah, well, so on the long-term side, so one of the predictions I made early on was, as soon as I saw that planes weren't flying around the globe anymore, was based on the observation that after 9/11, there was a 2-week window in the United States where there weren't a lot of planes in the air. And because of that, the planes aren't leaving their contrails. There's lower albedo or reflective surfaces, and more sun hit the earth, and the climate or earth meteorological sciences were saying, hey, there's a lot more heating down here, because without the planes constantly 24/7 sort of coating things, the more sunlight comes down. And so we had more heating in that moment. So it was an easy prediction to make, to say that this year globally, we're going to see quite a lot of heating. And so we've seen that. And so I think we have enough data here to say that the policies we're pursuing we need to have a conversation about this. Here's my frustration, and just stop me if this isn't the right conversation to be having here, but it's just that it's never a good time to have the conversation, right? Oh, we're in a crisis. Now's a bad time. Now we're not in a crisis later. Hey, there's no problem to talk about. It feels like there's never a good moment to sort of settle down and say, where do we really want to be going here?
Well, the other question is, what do you really want to be discussing, and what do you want to be doing? And I'm talking here, see, we can complain about the weather every day. We can complain about politics every day. It makes an interesting conversation, right? The question is, do we get involved to change policy, or do we accept policy and take steps in our own lives in order to deal with whatever we have, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, because peak prosperity is trying to do a hybrid here. On the one hand, You educate people so they know what's happening. On the other hand, you tell them the sort of steps that you think they may want to do for the sort of things that might be coming. I try to do some of that, and I try to do my education thing, and I also try to kind of teach investors on what to do along the way, and I try to influence policymakers a little bit with the sort of platform that I have, but I don't fool myself, right? I mean, Paul is not going to listen to me, and that's how we feel good, by expressing our views and getting a click on our like on our on our posts and our things. But of course, by having sensible arguments, maybe over time you can try to convince some people to go in the right direction. In the meantime, you just have to take precautions for the sort of world that we are heading towards.
Yeah. Well, I'm taking a little guidance from Buckminster Fuller, who I'll paraphrase badly here, said, you don't change anything by fighting the existing order. You just build a better model, and so that's what I'm doing in my own little local scale. And I think you're doing the same thing where I don't know how you're experiencing, but I find myself increasingly drawn towards doing things around the farm. And maybe it's because it gives me a sense of control, but I can see the direct impact of it. It feels good. I'm watching soil build. I'm interacting with animals. I have all these different plans for, how I'm going to slowly change the silviculture going up the hill and turn it into, kind of forest I want to see. That at least gives me a sense of agency.
Well, it helps us keep our sanity in all this, right? Because these are real things and real problems to deal with, not this abstract stuff, but money printing and all this wonderful stuff, right? You gotta have. I mean, that's why you have a hobby outside of work, so to speak, because you've got to get your mind off things.
Yeah, because it is kind of crazy making, and I've had a lot of conversations with people from all over different ideological spectrum and very liberal, very conservative. And I think if I was going to put an overarching sort of framework around what I think I've heard these people say, is that they're just shocked. They just can't make sense of what's happening right now. And I do think social media is a deserving punching bag for at least part of that. Their algorithms are doing everything they can to fracture us ideologically.
I've made a decision a long time ago just not to be the shocked deer in the headlights, so to speak, right? And so I just move on with life at some point, somehow. And so that means, from a business point of view, developing the business in a certain direction, and then yes, on the personal side, try to build something that's just more quote unquote real.
Yeah. Well, how do you? What's your practice for not being shocked?
Well, I have these discussions at the dinner table sometimes where I as a markets guy, I'm an analyst, right? When I talk to most people, especially about politics, you get emotions stirred up quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And I try to just take a step back and say, well, what the hell does that mean? Or maybe not the hell, but what does that mean? And so an interesting side effect of that is that I have friends throughout the political spectrum, right? And some folks don't understand why I talk to these guys and some on these guys. And I have a great interest in learning of where they're coming from. Now, do I have my own personal preference? Yes. But at the same time, I mean, what are you going to do, right? Does it change the course of the world if I get absolutely furious about something? And so I just try not to. It's sometimes easier said than done, right? I certainly get ticked off by certain things and then motivated by others. But I think it's just at heart of being an analyst that helps me look at things more abstractly. Doesn't mean, of course, that I'm right in any of my analysis, but at least I don't get quite as emotional. Yeah,
I that makes sense. I consider myself an analyst too, and it's tough when you're in a time when analysis doesn't count for much. That's why COVID was almost refreshing in some way for me from an analytical standpoint, because I could burrow into things and start to make sense of things, and there's science down there. I can't really make sense of where politics is right now, or monetary policy.
And of course, I mean, the other part is the communication part, right? I used to be the expert in something, and at some point, when the markets just went up and up and up for years, we started to be entertainers, right? The journalists would call us to just get some other opinion, but so I have over the years, actually, I'm talking less to the media than I used to. Because I don't have the need to be an entertainer for others. I'm too busy. I'm too busy for that, right? Yeah. So it's and you can also call it becoming a cynic over time, I suppose, right? That's another way of phrasing
it. As Lily Tomlin said, quip, she said, as cynical as I am, I find it's hard to keep up, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
So
Exactly.
that happens as we get into this. But I think I am, it feels to me like this is, we're in bubble territory again. Obviously, you can't make sense of certain stocks or IPOs or prices of things that have happened, and people can try and rationalize it. Oh, the market's this or that, but it's a bubble. I've lived through, this was my third, so I'm pretty sure I see what's going on. I know they last longer than I think they ought to. I think they should be blindingly obvious to everybody, and then they usually power on for another year or two. And here we are, and they're always destructive. And I'm just worried that this one is really going to be really harmful for a lot of folks. And
well obviously, because there's real suffering these days, right? In the early 2000s, people didn't realize that the policies kind of undermined the manufacturing base and moved people abroad. And because the U.S. economy is so dynamic, people adjusted. But they got frustrated. Their real wages didn't go anywhere. And now we've had the rise of populism, of course, and things aren't getting any better, right? I mean, people are suffering, and it's easy for us to say to do something, but we can work on the computer. We have our little field to watch the grass grow if you want to, and be okay with that. But a lot of people, their livelihood is at stake, and so it's. We're extremely fortunate, and so we count our blessings every day. And the question is really, what can we do to help others, right? And so we've tried a few things, but there is really no easy answer to that. We can do something in the local community, maybe, but on the big questions, we can try to educate people to kind of help them get in the right direction.
Yep, and I totally agree, and that's why I live on one side of this road I live on, and on the other side is a project that I'm sponsoring, shepherding, and we're going to revitalize an important sort of business element for this community. But the community is just thrilled with us. We just presented in front of the planning board yesterday, and they're thrilled because our mission is aligned with their mission as a town. They care a lot. They care a lot about the living history of this town and protecting it, and not a lot of egos involved. They just care about the town, and it's a great little town. But what we're planning to do is create a place where people can come and have experiences where they're going to re-experience nature. I know there's millions of people leaving New York City and Boston and Chicago and all of that, and many of them have never started a fire before outside. They've never cooked over a fire. They never split a piece of wood. They've never planted anything in a ground or picked anything off of a living plant and put it in their mouth. So these are the sorts of experiences we want to start reconnecting people with, but it leads to a larger question, Axel, that I see a lot of people kind of my age struggling with. For people over 50 who just lost their jobs, who are really struggling in the way you just mentioned, it's not obvious what their next steps are and how they're going to reinvent themselves. So that's the sort of, in our own small way, we're going to create a place where people can come together and have those experiences and conversations, because it is not obvious and we're in this together. So I'm finding myself more in a service mode and in a giving mode, and in trying to use my relative advantage and luck in this story to give back as best I can at this stage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And by the way, have Adam reach out to me about doing something at our vineyard, right? At some point, because that's perfectly suited for the sort of things that you're saying, and that's certainly very compatible with the sort of things we're looking to do.
Good. Well, as we wrap this up, anything left unsaid here from your end? Did we forget to discuss gold or something important? Or
it's 2020. I mean, what else is there to be said, right? I mean, it's
I thought 2016 was bad.
It's crazy. No, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I think you have a conference coming up that people want to attend. We can pitch that, but beyond that, yeah, I mean, have a plan, right? That's really be that for life, be that for investing. Have a plan, and don't think that this stuff is going to be over. There's always just going to be the next phase, and so don't get holed up at home because you're thinking at some point somebody's going to say, "Hey, everything back to normal." It's not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for the pre-pitch pitch. Yes, our seminar is coming up, and that's going to be October 23rd and 4th. That's Saturday, Sunday, recorded live, but also it'll all be available online. It's a digital seminar this year because we're not doing one in person for obvious reasons, but you'll be there. and I'll be there. So yeah, anybody who wants to attend but never thought they could, take the time or fly all that or do whatever, we're making it easy this year. So we'll give it a go, see how it is. It's always great to see people in person. I think this is the best we can do in its stead. So yeah, well, thanks so much for your time today. And I'm really sorry to hear that the fires came so close, but glad that you were spared there. So best of
All
luck.
right. Well, be safe out there, and all everybody listening to this as well. All right. Thanks, then. Take care.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.